Anarchism was not born in an ivory tower, a library in England, or any academic circle. Rather, anarchism was born out of the wariness, the fever, and the fret of the early working class in response to the Industrial Revolution. This is the Anarcho-Tech. In this video, I would like to briefly understand the origins of anarchism. I hope that it will not only help us understand anarchy, but will also help us understand the limitations of classical anarchism, and will stand as a kind of platform for a trajectory into new forms of anarchism. To understand the origins of anarchism, you have to understand the Industrial Revolution. So let's quickly look at that. What had begun with a revolutionary change in the way agriculture was done, a shift from manual labor to machine labor, soon led to changes in business, manufacturing, mining, transportation, and city engineering. These things had a huge effect on socioeconomics and culture, first in the UK and then throughout all of Europe. You can read any history book and get a better understanding of what exactly happened. It's pretty interesting. Almost every aspect of daily life was affected by these changes. We all know that. Typically, this movement is portrayed in a positive manner, and we're all familiar with the supposed positive effects, or I should say the ideological effects, of the Industrial Revolution. However, there was a dark side to the Industrial Revolution. A new class system had emerged, with the rich generating more money than ever before, and the poor left behind. And of course there was a middle class, but they were too absorbed to think. Various parties emerged in response to these initial conditions, all united by the urgency of the problems and the desire for liberation. It's pretty inspirational when you look at this. But over a short time, however, their differences became more apparent in theory and practice. They started to quibble amongst one another, and they soon fractured into various other parties. The most radical of these parties were the anarchist, or libertarian socialist, as they were known then and are still known worldwide. I have a video on this fact if you'd like to look at it. Anarchists were calling for the negation of these current social and economic practices because it was domineering, destructive, and harmful to our lives. Such calls can be found in hundreds of various pamphlets and papers written by members of the working class, long before Proudhon, Bakunin, and Kropotkin emerged. And that's kind of the point of my video, and that anarchism emerged out of anonymous, everyday people, rather than a group of intellectuals. And this fact really separates anarchism from other movements and says quite a bit about the nature of anarchism. Kropotkin says that, so anarchism does not derive from abstract reflections of an intellectual or a philosopher, but from the direct struggle of workers against capitalism, from the needs and necessities of the workers, from their aspirations to liberty and equality, aspirations which become particularly alive in the best heroic period of life and struggle of the working masses. The outstanding anarchist thinkers, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and others, did not invent the idea of anarchism, but, having discovered it in the masses, simply helped by the strength of their thought and knowledge to specify and spread it. And this is from the organizational platform of the Libertarian Communist, an early anarchist movement in the Russian Revolution. The working class. Anarchism is born of the working class and the peasant class by people resisting the demeaning authority of both capitalist and communist. They were not divorced from life, hidden in ivory towers, as I said at the beginning of this video, but were drenched in the blood and sweat of the struggle. These are everyday people. These aren't intellectuals. Most of them were basically uneducated, at least by our standards. And anarchism, according to Kropotkin, emerged out of the struggle of everyday life and a trust in common sense. Again, it's not an intellectual movement, at least it wasn't initially. For Proudhon, the proof of anarchism was apparent in these early triumphs of organized labor. Anarchists were not quarterbacking these movements. Instead, they were merely articulating what was already happening within these worker movements. This stuff was already going on long before so-called anarchists emerged as theorists. Workers were organizing themselves in a manner in which they didn't necessarily call anarchist, but they called common sense. And that's interesting, and you see that in a lot of these early pamphlets. The apparent leaders of early anarchism were more often than not simply bourgeois writers trying to capture what was happening. The leaders were the workers. Typically we see anarchism as being led by Proudhon or Kropotkin, but it wasn't. They were behind. They were just articulating what was already going on. Early anarchists recognized that they were attempting to implement a form of organization that had existed before in pre-industrial eras, in tribal communities worldwide, and in small everyday experiences. This is also apparent in these early anarchist pamphlets. Kropotkin said that the labor combinations were an outcome of the same popular resistance to the growing power of the few, the capitalist in this case, as were the clan, the village community, and so on, as were the strikingly independent, freely federated activity sections of Paris and all great cities, many small communes during the French Revolution in 1793. I'm speaking of the modern origins of anarchism. But many North American indigenous tribes have practiced anarchism for thousands of years, if not much longer, before anarchism emerged as a specific political theory. Similarly, anarchist tendencies and organizations have existed in most major revolutions. For instance, New England town meetings during the American Revolution, those were driven by anarchist ideals, at least at first. The Parisian sections during the French Revolution, and the workers' councils and factory committees during the Russian Revolution. And this list can go on and on. More articulately in the Spanish Revolution, in which anarchists did emerge as the so-called leaders of this movement for freedom. Thus, anarchism is the struggle against the domination and exploitation. Such a struggle has emerged any time a system attempts to dominate and exploit. And it's not always called anarchism. It can be called by many other names. This struggle has existed long before what we know as anarchism emerged as a general theory. The modern struggle was born out of the working class struggle against domination and exploitation of capitalism and early communism. The genuine struggle for freedom, liberty, and solidarity is always anarchistic at its basis. What I hope to explore later are the interactions between early Marxist and anarchist, where they agreed and where they disagreed, because this will bring out the more important aspects of anarchism in its origins. Thanks for watching. I hope you leave some comments.